So the other day I created an RxJS stream that dealt with scroll events on the browser, and in that particular case every scroll event was meaningful to the application, and therefore I would expect every scroll event to trigger change detection. But this got me thinking about the interaction between RxJS and change detection in general, and if there's things that I can do to increase performance when I deal with operators like throttle time, where the event doesn't necessarily map any longer from a one-to-one perspective on things that I'm actually interested in or that may change the view model. And as I started to look into RxJS and Angular's change detection lifecycle, I realized things are not quite as clear or as simple as they are in other aspects of an Angular component. So to demonstrate, what we would normally want to do if we wanted something to be more performant is we could perhaps bind parts of it outside of the Angular zone. And this is what I'm trying to do here. I'm listening to mouse move events on the document, and I'm only throttling them to every 2 seconds. And then I'm going to map that mouse event to some sort of position, and inside the component init method you can see here that I'm getting that mouse position stream, I'm subscribing to it, and I'm using that to change the view model. And the view model is then just being output into the template. Now I also have the NgDoCheck lifecycle method on the Angular component, which will give us some insight into how often Angular's change detection algorithm is being executed. So what we're going to see is, as we move the mouse around, how many of these log statements get fired, and does the run outside Angular with RxJS work as we might expect it to. So let's go over to the browser, let's refresh. You can see here we have already 2 digests that run as the application is bootstrapping, but now as I mouse around, notice that we're getting a tremendous number of change detection digests running, even though our values here are only updating about every 2 seconds, right, as that throttle is being put in place. So it turns out that RxJS is by default not really Zone.js aware. And as I started to look into this, what I discovered was that the Zone library actually provides some patch files for third-party libraries like RxJS. Now, if we include this patch file, what Angular does is look at the RxJS library and patch some of the RxJS methods to become more zone aware, such that events can be controlled a little bit more granularly with the change detection algorithm. So now with that in place, let's refresh, and now you'll see that as I mouse around, we're no longer getting that stream of digest changes. In fact, we only trigger a new digest every 2 seconds when that throttle allows the event to be propagated down to the subscriber. Now what you'll notice is that although we bound the mouse move event outside of the Angular zone, we never actually jump back into the Angular zone explicitly. So I think what's happening is that the monkey patch that Angular is applying to the RxJS library is actually based on the contextual zone of the subscribe callback. So I think it takes whatever the zone is that this was subscribed in, and then uses that to apply when the subscriber is being invoked. I don't really understand how any of that works behind the scenes. I looked at the patch file, but it's just Greek to me, honestly. And just to demonstrate that the patch file alone isn't sufficient, we can go through and let's comment out the whole run outside here. Right, so now we're just back to that idea of binding from the mouse move event and propagating that through the throttle and so on and so forth. And then we jump back in here and we refresh. And again, we're back to this tremendous stream of digests being triggered. Right, so we have to include the patch file, and we have to explicitly bind the event source outside of the Angular zone, and then we'll let the patching re-enter the Angular zone implicitly whenever the subscriber is invoked. And again, let's refresh, and we can see now that we have that every 2 second throttling of both the view model propagation here as well as the change detection being called, or calling the NgDoCheck method. So to be clear, I am in no way recommending that people just start including this. For one, it's not compatible, from what I can see, with the current RxJS library, which means that you have to include the RxJS compat library to make the version 6 of RxJS compatible with the version 5 module paths. This unfortunately has the side effect of including the entire RxJS library in your application, which makes the file, of course, much larger, the vendor file much larger than you would want it to be. Furthermore, I can't imagine there are too many scenarios in which you actually want to discard events that are propagated down through an RxJS stream. So the chances that you run into this pre-throttle, post-throttle difference in change detection requirements, I have to believe is pretty much an edge case. And even in that case, it might just be easier to take the hit of more digests rather than creating a larger vendor file for every single load of your application. Anyway, this was just more of a learning process for me, trying to understand a little bit more about Zone.js. Zone.js is definitely something I've just considered magical. It just sort of works out of the box. But when you dig into it a little bit more, it's not quite as clean as maybe my simplistic mental model thought it was. And if nothing else, it makes me want to become a little bit more cognizant of when I use RxJS and how RxJS dovetails with change detection and how Angular manages change detection with events that cross these sort of seams in the application, the Angular application.